A cowgirl had embraced solitude for years before 7 handsome widowers appeared, asking for refuge for the night. But what Nora Steele perceived in their gazes on that turbulent evening was not neediness. It was an emotion far more perilous. The wind wailed like a creature in agony across the stark landscape, shaking every loose plank of Nora's time-worn ranch house. She was standing at her kitchen window, a cup of coffee cooling in her weathered hands, as she watched the storm front consume the final remnants of daylight. For 8 years, no one had crossed her property line without an invitation. For 8 years, she had guarded her isolation fiercely. The sound of horse hooves slicing through the downpour caused her to go still. Through the curtains of rain streaming from her eaves, she could discern 7 figures on horseback, their dark forms hunched over against the gale. Men, every one of them, moving with an urgency that suggested they had no other destination. Nora placed her mug down with measured deliberation. Her hand reflexively went to the rifle mounted over her hearth, but then paused. These were not outlaws or cattle thieves, yet something about their formation, too tight, too synchronized, too determined, made the hair on her arms stand on end. The lead horseman was the first to dismount. Even in the deluge, Nora could tell he was strikingly handsome, with dark hair stuck to his brow and traveling clothes that were torn but clearly of high quality. He walked toward her porch with the assurance of a man used to having his requests granted. The other 6 stayed on their horses, their features obscured by the brims of their hats, but their carriage suggested men who had witnessed an excess of the world's harshness. The man called, his voice penetrating the wind's howl. "We beg you, we require shelter from this storm." Nora observed them through the window pane. The situation felt wrong. 7 men traveling unaccompanied through this forsaken land in weather that could fell a seasoned traveler, and their horses. Those were not the exhausted nags of desperate folk. These were powerful, well-tended animals. She recalled her mother's words from long ago, a person's true nature is revealed in how they treat those who can offer them nothing. But her mother had never encountered men who carried themselves like soldiers while offering smiles that concealed deep secrets. The dark-haired man knocked once more, with more force. "Please, miss." "We'll never reach town in this tempest." Nora strode to the door, her boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. Every fiber of her being urged her to leave the door bolted. 8 years of solitude had ingrained in her that people were a source of trouble and pain. But the storm was worsening. And even if these men were fugitives, she could not abide them perishing on her land. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. Through the solid wood, she could hear them speaking in low murmurs, their words lost to the wind, perhaps plotting or merely trying to conserve warmth. She was unaware that by opening that door, every principle she held about good and evil, trust and deception, and the true cost of loneliness would be challenged in ways that would make her question if some acts of charity were worth their price. Because these 7 men had not stumbled upon her ranch by chance, and the gale that drove them to her was a trifle compared to the tempest they were poised to unleash within her home. Nora unlatched the door, and the storm swept in like an invasive guest. The handsome man stood on her porch, rain dripping from his coat, but his blue eyes held not gratitude, but shrewd assessment. Behind him, the 6 others had already dismounted and were guiding their horses to her barn as if they owned the place. "My thanks," he said, stepping over the threshold before she could reconsider. "My name is Julian Vance. These are my companions on the road." The slight hesitation before he said companions on the road made Nora's jaw clench. She peered through the open doorway as the men moved with practiced efficiency, stabling their horses as if they had done it 1,000 times before. These were not helpless widowers trapped by bad weather. These were men with an agenda. "Where are you headed?" Nora inquired, shutting the door behind Julian but keeping her hand near the rifle. "Oregon," he answered easily, shrugging off his coat to reveal clothing that had cost more than many earned in a year. "My wife left me a parcel of land there. We all lost our spouses recently. We decided to make the trip together for security." The other men entered one by one, each more ruggedly handsome than the one before, and all of them possessing that same unsettling blend of vulnerability and threat. There was a young blonde man, no older than 25, with eyes that held ancient sorrows, a broad-shouldered man with scarred hands that hinted at violence, and one with red hair who smiled too readily and observed everything. They offered their thanks in smooth, deep voices, but their eyes scanned her home, seemingly taking inventory of every item of worth. The manner in which they arranged themselves in her small parlor, never turning their backs on one another and always maintaining clear access to the exit, sent a chill through Nora's veins. "We are mighty obliged for your kindness," the youngest one said, his long lashes fluttering. "We've been on the trail for days. Haven't seen another person for an age." That was an untruth. Nora had spotted dust clouds from riders earlier that day, perhaps 3 hours behind these men. Someone was pursuing them, and they were aware of it. "The coffee's still hot," Nora offered, as a test. "Help yourselves while I check on your animals, though. Please don't trouble yourself," Julian interjected swiftly. "Our horses are settled. We are quite adept at looking after our own needs." Another warning sign. Men in this country rarely turn down assistance with their mounts, particularly in a storm like this. And the way Julian's hand kept drifting toward a concealed object in his coat told Nora he was armed and prepared to use it. She went to the kitchen, pouring coffee with hands that were steady despite the sirens blaring in her mind. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see their mounts in her barn. Magnificent creatures with quality tag, but the foam around their bits indicated they had been ridden hard and fast. They were fleeing something, not meandering toward Oregon. "A fine property you have here," remarked the broad-shouldered man, touching the material of her curtains. "Must be a solitary life for a woman all alone." "I like it that way," Nora stated, distributing tin cups. "It's less complicated." The men shared quick, loaded glances that affirmed Nora's suspicions. Their arrival was no accident, and they had no intention of departing peacefully at dawn. As thunder boomed overhead, Julian moved to her window and stared out into the blackness. "A dreadful night to be caught and sheltered," he said softly. "It's fortunate we found your ranch when we did." But the way he was watching the path, the stiffness in his frame, told Nora his concern wasn't for the weather. He was watching for their pursuers. And when those riders showed up, because they would show up, Nora would be trapped in the middle of a conflict that would make this storm seem like a summer shower. What she didn't yet grasp was that she had sealed her fate the moment she opened her door. By sunrise, she would either be dead or she would learn that sometimes the most lethal predators arrive disguised as defenseless lambs. The clock on Nora's mantel struck 9, each chime resonating in the tension-thickened air. The men had made themselves comfortable in her home as if they belonged there, but their eyes were in constant motion, ceaselessly assessing. Julian remained by the window, his gaze fixed on the storm with the focus of a predator watching its quarry. "Tell me about your wives," Nora said, sinking into her armchair with her coffee. "What sort of women were they?" The question landed in the room with the force of a physical impact. The young blond man, who had identified himself as Leo, almost fumbled his cup. The redhead's easy smile disappeared for the first time since his arrival. But Julian pivoted from the window, his expression cold enough to freeze fire. "They are dead women," he stated flatly. "The kind best left undiscussed." Nora gave a slow nod, examining each man's face. "A curious thing about widowers in these parts. Most travel with kin or friends from their hometown. Most don't conceal pistols under their coats." The brawny man, named Marcus, shifted in his seat, and Nora saw the brief flash of steel beneath his jacket. "A man traveling alone needs to be able to defend himself," he said, his voice low. 7 men traveling alone, Nora countered. 7 handsome men with first-rate horses, fine attire, and enough weaponry among you to arm a posse. That doesn't sound like widowers heading to Oregon. That sounds like something else entirely." The youngest, who had been quiet since he arrived, suddenly shot to his feet. His hands were trembling, and tears streamed down his cheeks. "I can't do this any longer," he choked out. "I can't keep up this charade." "Sit down, Leo," Julian ordered, his voice as sharp as a shard of glass. But Leo shook his head, retreating toward the door. "She's shown us nothing but decency, and we're about to." He couldn't complete the thought. The atmosphere in the room grew frigid. Every man was now glaring at Leo with looks ranging from rage to alarm. Nora felt her hand inch toward her rifle as understanding began to crystallize in her mind. "About to what, Leo?" she prompted softly. Before Leo could reply, the sound of more approaching horses tore through the storm's racket. Several riders, moving quickly despite the treacherous conditions. Julian whirled toward the window, his face draining of color. "They found us," he whispered. The other men were instantly on their feet, suddenly brandishing a collection of firearms that had been hidden under their gentlemanly exteriors. Pistols, knives, and even a compact shotgun that the redhead produced from his travel bag. "Who has found you?" Nora demanded, getting up from her chair. Julian turned to her, and for the first time, she saw raw fear in his eyes. "Men who do not respond well to being robbed," he admitted. "Men who have pursued us for 3 days across 2 territories." The puzzle pieces slammed into place. These were not widowers. They were outlaws, swindlers, and they had led a pack of vengeful men directly to her doorstep. "How much did you take?" Nora asked. "Enough to make them exceedingly angry," Julian answered. The horses were drawing nearer. Through the storm, Nora could hear shouts, coarse voices yelling threats and promising brutal retribution. Leo was now weeping openly, while the other men were checking their weapons with the proficiency of those who had killed before. But what none of them realized, what Nora hadn't spoken of in 8 long years, was that before she became a reclusive cowgirl, she had been someone else entirely. Someone who just might keep them all breathing through the night, if she judged them worthy of being saved. The riders swarmed into Nora's yard like fiends unleashed. Through the rain-battered windows, she counted at least 8 of them, possibly more. Their commander, a hulking man in a dark oilskin coat, swung down from his horse and began shouting commands that sliced through the gale. "Fan out! Search the barn! If they're in there, I want them breathing." Julian seized Nora's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Please," he implored, all his pretense gone. "They'll slaughter every one of us if they find us here." Nora looked into his eyes and saw a terror she knew well, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what men are capable of when they believe they've been wronged. She had seen that expression before, in her own reflection and on the faces of those she couldn't save. "What did you steal from them?" she demanded. "Money," Marcus answered. "A fortune from their poker game in Deadwood." "How much?" "Enough to purchase a small county," Leo whispered. The young man was now huddled in a corner, rocking himself. "They're going to do horrible things to us," he cried. "Things far worse than death." A thunderous banging on Nora's door made them all flinch. The voice that came next was gravelly, menacing, and utterly sure of its authority. "Open this door. We know you have them." Nora glanced at the 7 men, truly seeing them now. Underneath their handsome faces and their weapons, their lies and their fear, she saw something that reminded her of her brother who had died because no one was there to shield him when vicious men came to call. She reached for her rifle, but then stopped. Instead, she went to a loose floorboard by the hearth and pried it up, uncovering a hidden cache of weapons that made the men's collection look like children's playthings. Military-grade rifles, boxes of ammunition, and another item that made Julian's eyes go wide. "You're not just a cowgirl," he breathed. "I used to be a marshal," Nora said, checking the action on a repeating rifle. "Before I concluded that civilization wasn't worth the trouble." The door imploded, spraying splinters like shrapnel. The first man to storm in was built like a bear, with facial scars that narrated tales of violence and eyes that promised more. He was followed by others, hard-bitten men with even harder expressions, the sort who'd trade their own kin for a fast horse and a bottle. "Well, now," the leader drawled, rain dripping from his hat. "Nora Steele. Heard you'd gone soft, hiding away playing at being a rancher." "Hello, Cormac," Nora responded, her voice as steady as granite. "Still chasing down debts for cowards who won't do their own dirty work." Cormac Doolan. Nora should have guessed. The man had built a reputation on finding people who wished to remain lost and making them regret ever being born. His presence meant these men had stolen from someone extremely powerful. "Hand over the gentleman, Nora, and we'll leave you be." "This doesn't need to concern you." "I'm afraid it already does," Nora stated, placing herself between Cormac and the 7 men. "They requested sanctuary." "I gave my word." Cormac let out a laugh like stones grinding together. "Your word? To a pack of thieves?" "They stole from the wrong people, Nora. Money that belongs to men who don't forgive or forget. Then they should have picked their card partners more carefully. Hand them over, or we'll take them and everything you possess. Nora held Cormac's gaze without wavering. You're welcome to try. The ensuing silence was thick with the promise of violence. 8 armed men against 1 former lawwoman and 7 cornered thieves. The odds were grim, the scenario desperate, and the storm outside felt placid compared to the one about to erupt in that little ranch house. But Cormac was ignorant of the secret Nora had kept for 8 years, the true reason she had abandoned civilization. And when the bullets started flying, that secret was going to transform a massacre into something far more fascinating. The standoff was a wire-pulled taut, about to break. Cormac's crew had filtered through Nora's small home, their guns aimed at the cluster of men sheltering behind the former marshal. The storm outside seemed to be holding its breath, awaiting the eruption of violence. You know, Nora, Cormac began, slowly pulling off his sodden gloves, I've heard some compelling tales about why you truly quit the marshal service. Something about a bank heist in Silver Creek. Something about key evidence that just vanished. Nora's jaw muscle jumped, but she stayed silent. Behind her, she could feel Julian's eyes on her back, re-evaluating everything he assumed he knew about his unwilling protector. Oh, yes, Cormac went on, relishing the moment. Seems a large sum of money never found its way back to the bank. A very large sum. Makes one wonder how a simple lawwoman could afford a spread like this. You're casting your line in a dry well, Cormac. Am I? Cormac nodded to his men, and they tightened their grips on their weapons. See, the way I see it, you and these gentlemen have something in common. You're all thieves. The only difference is, you got away clean. Leo let out a sob from his corner, and the blond man gripped his pistol so hard his knuckles were white. Marcus was scanning for angles, seeking any possible advantage, while the smiling redhead, Finn, seemed almost thrilled by the impending bloodshed. But it was Julian who did the unexpected. He stepped forward, moving past Nora's defensive posture to confront Cormac face to face. The money we took, he said in a low voice. It wasn't just sitting on a poker table. It was payment for girls. Young girls, bought and sold like livestock. The room fell utterly silent. Even Cormac's hardened men shifted uneasily. We didn't rob gamblers, Julian pressed on, his voice gaining strength. We stole from men who profit from human suffering. Men who annihilate innocence for a price. That's a touching fable, Cormac sneered, but a flicker of uncertainty had entered his tone. Doesn't alter the fact you took what wasn't yours. It was never theirs to begin with, Marcus spoke up, his own firearm now in view. Every last dollar was paid for with a child suffering. Nora looked at the 7 men with a dawning new insight. They weren't just thieves, they were vigilantes, dispensing the justice the law had failed to deliver. It explained their coordination, their skill with weapons, their meticulous planning. These men weren't running to Oregon, they were running towards absolution. Makes no difference to me, Cormac said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. A job's a job. Money is money, even blood money. Nora asked. Especially blood money. It pays better. That was when Nora made her decision. Not merely to shield 7 men, but to take a stand against the very evil that had haunted her dreams for years. The same evil she had failed to defeat in Silver Creek. The same darkness that had exiled her to this isolation. She moved with the swiftness of a woman half her age. The rifle in her hand spoke before Cormac could even draw his pistol. The bullet tore into the large man's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Does anyone else care to argue the ethics of human trafficking? Nora asked, working the rifle's lever. The remaining men now faced not just a former marshal with a lifetime of combat experience, but 7 men who had already shown their readiness to kill for their convictions. The odds had just changed profoundly, and the storm raging outside was about to feel like a calm day compared to the judgment that was coming. The gunfight exploded like a clap of thunder. Cormac's men, startled by Nora's sudden attack and the damning revelation about their employers, paused for a fatal instant. That single second cost them dearly. Julian's pistol barked twice, felling the man closest to the door. Leo and Marcus moved like a well-oiled machine, their weapons finding their marks with lethal accuracy. Finn laughed as he fired, a sound more chilling than any battle cry. Nora operated her rifle like an extension of her will, each shot calculated and final. Years of solitude had not diminished her skills as a lawwoman. If anything, the isolation had honed her focus, clarifying her mission. These men had invaded her home to collect human chattel. They would be carried out as corpses. "Fall back!" Cormac shrieked, blood gushing from his shoulder. "Back to the horses!" But there was no escape. The storm outside had intensified, transforming the world beyond her ranch into a screaming abyss. And inside, 7 men and 1 former marshal had made her humble home into a killing floor. One of Cormac's men tried to use Leo as a human shield, grabbing the young man and holding a knife to his throat. "Drop your guns or he dies." It was then that Nora saw something that froze her blood. On the man's wrist, just visible under his grimy cuff, was a brand. A symbol she had seen before, in Silver Creek. On the wrist of a dead girl who couldn't have been more than 14. The very same mark these men had been fighting. "You know what that emblem means, don't you?" Julian called out, noticing Nora's flash of recognition. "You've seen it before." Nora had indeed seen it before, on victims, on evidence that had strangely vanished, on bodies written off as accidents. The insignia of a syndicate that treated people like property, that bought and sold the innocent to the highest bidder. Silver Creek, she breathed, the full picture flooding her mind. That's why the evidence went missing. That's why the investigation was shut down. Your own people were complicit, Marcus confirmed, his gun still aimed at Cormac. Judges, sheriffs, politicians, all of them bought. The man holding Leo pressed the blade tighter. "I said, drop your weapons." Instead, Nora did something that astounded everyone. She laid her rifle on the floor and reached into her shirt, pulling out a small metal badge. Not her old marshal's star, but something different. Something that made Cormac's eyes widen with recognition and terror. "Federal Marshal," Nora said calmly. "Special Division. I've been hunting your organization for 8 years." The room fell dead silent, save for the storm. Cormac stared at the badge as if it were a deadly viper. "The Hermit Act," Julian breathed. "It was all a cover." "Deep cover," Nora confirmed, her gaze locked on the man holding Leo. "Waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike at the heart of this entire operation, you son of a," Cormac snarled. "You've been playing us all 8 years," Nora reiterated. 8 years of watching, listening, mapping your whole network. Your bosses, your routes, your buyers. Every name, every place, every sale. The man with the knife was sweating now, understanding he was trapped between federal law and 7 men who had already proven their deadly resolve. His hand shook as he held the blade to Leo's throat. "Let him go," Nora said softly, "and I'll see to it you live long enough to testify." "Against who?" the man demanded. "Everyone. Every politician on your payroll. Every judge who turned a blind eye. Every sheriff who buried a case. I have 8 years of files hidden where your masters will never find them." "You're bluffing," Nora smiled, and it was the most chilling expression anyone in the room had ever witnessed. "Test me." The man's nerve broke. His knife wavered, and in that fleeting moment of indecision, Leo showed he was far stronger than anyone had assumed. He slammed an elbow into the man's gut and wrenched himself free, leaving his captor exposed to 7 very angry men with 7 very loaded guns. What followed would haunt Cormac's nightmares for the remainder of his brief existence. The man who had threatened Leo was dead before his body struck the floor. 7 guns fired as one, making him a bloody example of the folly of underestimating cornered men. The volley echoed through the ranch house like a final judgment. Cormac, bleeding and defeated, gazed at the carnage that had once been his crew. Bodies were draped over Nora's furniture, their blood staining the floorboards that had known 8 years of quiet peace. Only 2 of his men were still alive, both wounded, both staring at the federal badge in Nora's hand as if it were their death sentence. "You played every one of us," Cormac wheezed, clutching his shoulder. "All this time, you were a Fed. All this time, you were scum," Nora retorted, holstering her sidearm. "The difference is, I was doing my duty." Julian lowered his still-smoking pistol, his blue eyes appraising Nora with newfound respect. 8 years. 8 years of building a case. That requires a rare kind of fortitude, that requires a rare kind of fury, Nora corrected. A controlled fury. The kind that doesn't extinguish. It just burns hotter. Leo had stopped weeping. He stood over the body of his would-be killer, his youthful face transformed by something harder than sorrow, purer than revenge. How many? He asked quietly. How many what? Cormac gasped. How many girls did your masters buy and sell? How many innocent lives paid for your filthy money? Cormac tried to laugh, but it turned into a bloody cough. You think killing us changes a thing? You think this is the end? No, Nora said, kneeling beside the dying man. This is only the beginning. You see, I didn't just spend 8 years observing. I spent 8 years collecting names, dates, transactions, and locations. Every single detail of your vile trade is mapped out where? Cormac demanded. Safe, Nora answered. In federal hands. And now that you've validated my intelligence by showing up here tonight, by admitting what these men stole, by wearing those brands on your wrists. Well, now I have everything I need to dismantle the entire syndicate. Marcus moved to the window, scanning for more riders. Is it truly finished? He asked. For us, it is, Julian said, finally letting himself believe it. He looked at Nora. But for them? What becomes of the men at the top? The ones who never get their hands dirty, they will fall, Nora said simply. All of them. Federal marshals are moving on safe houses across 3 territories as we speak. By dawn, the organization that ruined so many lives will be nothing but a dark memory. The storm outside was at last starting to subside. Through the splintered doorway, the first light of morning touched the sky with hues of hope. But inside the ranch house, surrounded by bodies and blood, 7 men and 1 federal marshal sat in the aftermath of their private war. What about us? The blond man asked. We're still wanted men. We still took that money. Evidence money, Nora corrected. Confiscated during a federal operation. You gentlemen were just assisting in the execution of a warrant. Finn laughed, the sound lighter now, cleaner. So, we're heroes then? You're survivors, Nora said. And sometimes, that's the same thing. But as the morning light grew brighter, revealing the full extent of the night's violence, Nora wondered if any of them could ever truly escape the darkness they had confronted. Victory always came at a cost, and sometimes that cost was measured in pieces of a soul that could never be reclaimed. The only question left was whether what they had managed to save was worth what they had lost to save it. The sun ascended, bathing Nora's ranch in a golden radiance that seemed almost profane after the night's brutality. The storm was gone, leaving a world that felt freshly laundered. Inside the ranch house, however, the evidence of their battle remained in drying pools of blood and the lingering scent of gunpowder. Cormac had expired in the night, his final breath a curse. His 2 surviving henchmen sat bound and defeated, awaiting the arrival of the federal marshals Nora had summoned. The vile network was broken. But the price of that victory hung heavy in the air. Leo had found his resolve. What becomes of us now? He asked, no longer the terrified youth from the night before. The ordeal had forged him into something harder, something that could be either a shield or a weapon. You vanish, Nora told him, meticulously cleaning her rifle with the focus of someone who understood the value of proper maintenance. New identities, new histories, new territories. The government has programs for that. Do we stay together? Julian asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. That's your decision. But you must understand, you can never be those men again. The 7 who rode in here last night are gone forever. What leaves this place are entirely new men. Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of that statement. Perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps those men deserve to die. The sound of approaching horses put them all on edge, but these were federal riders, arriving in the full light of day with official badges. The cleanup detail had come to process the scene, to remove the bodies, to distill a night of raw violence into cold, bureaucratic reports. Federal Marshal Williams, the lead rider, announced. You signaled the operation was a success, complete and successful, Nora confirmed. The network is shattered. The evidence is secured. These men are now under federal protection. Marshal Williams regarded the 7 men with the practiced eye of someone too familiar with human depravity to be easily shocked. They'll need new identities. It's a costly process. They paid the price, Nora said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Paid in blood. The most expensive currency there is. As the federal team went about their grim work, the 7 men prepared to part ways with the woman who had saved not just their lives, but perhaps their souls. Leo lingered, approaching Nora hesitantly. The money we took, he said softly. What will really happen to it? Nora looked at him. What would you want to happen to it? There are sanctuaries, he whispered. Safe havens for girls who've been damaged. Places that desperately need funds, that need protection. Nora nodded, understanding completely. I will ensure it gets to the right hands. Julian was the last to speak with her. You could have handed us over, he said. Claimed the bounty, lived out your days in peace. Peace isn't a destination you arrive at, Nora replied. It's a choice you make, day after day. Last night, I chose to side with people who were protecting the innocent. That's the closest to peace a person like me can get. And you? What's next for the federal marshal, now that this is all over? Nora surveyed her ranch, now blood-spattered and irrevocably marked by the violence it had hosted. I believe my cover has been compromised, she said with the ghost of a smile. Time to find a new mission. The men rode out as the sun reached its zenith, heading toward new lives under new names, a future that very few are ever given a chance to create for themselves. They vanished into the vastness of the territory, dissolving like smoke in the clean morning air. Nora stood in her doorway and watched them go, reflecting on 8 years of patient waiting and 1 night of terrible, decisive action. The house behind her needed to be cleansed, repaired, and exorcised of its ghosts. But for the first time in nearly a decade, she felt a profound sense of rightness. Sometimes, the greatest triumphs are the ones that leave the deepest scars. Sometimes, the most critical battles are won by those who have nothing left to lose. And sometimes, mercy and justice ride together down a dusty trail, leaving the world just a little bit better than they found it. The cowgirl who had lived in solitude for years had opened her door to 7 handsome strangers, and in doing so, had rediscovered the woman she was always meant to be.